Today on SPG1 Tactical, we spring into action with the Armory Craft Positive Reset Trigger Return Spring. Springs are a small but very important component of a firearm. Multiple springs work in conjunction to either feed, cycle, fire, reset, extract, or lock in varying parts of the weapon system. Springs can also have different tensions or wear out over time, which is good for customization, but bad in terms of maintenance and wear. When you pull out a SIG P320 fire control unit, one of the first and most prominent springs that you'll notice is what is called the trigger bar spring or trigger return spring. This spring connects the trigger bar to the frame of the fire control unit and aids in resetting the trigger back into firing position after depressing the trigger. When you pull the trigger to the rear, the spring compresses, and when the pressure is removed from the trigger, this spring forces the trigger bar, and therefore the trigger, back forward. Now, while this does provide some resistive force against the trigger pull, most of the trigger pull and break weight is based upon the sear springs, but the return force is affected directly by the trigger return spring. So when I took out my highly customized Icarus Precision SIG P320 to an event and allowed patrons to shoot it, the only critical response that I received was that they wished that it had a more positive trigger reset on my Armory Craft double adjustable trigger. Other than that, it was the belle of the ball. I then set out to troubleshoot, compare, and possibly find a solution for what some were considering to be a problem, and this led me to finding the Armory Craft Positive Reset Trigger Return Spring. At just under $10 per spring and already having two Armory Craft triggers in P320 platforms, I felt this was a sign to go ahead and grab a few for some testing. The Armory Craft Positive Reset Trigger Return Spring is a torsion spring designed to replace the stock return spring and increase the trigger return pressure without egregiously increasing the pull weight. The website advertisement states that you should get approximately a 10% increase in trigger reset while increasing the trigger pull by less than half a pound. When compared side by side, there are no significant changes at first glance. But if you look closer or pull out some calipers, you'll start to notice some small differences. First, the Armory Craft spring is black, which is a result of the alloy of A401 chrome silicon wire, which appears to be different from the stock spring, and the black is not a zinc phosphate coating like on the NDZ Performance spring. The other thing that I noticed is that there appears to be no bend on the final coil of the dogleg side of the spring. All other 320 springs that I've dealt with have this little bend right after the coil, and the Armory Craft does not appear to have this. Now, I reached out to Armory Craft for more information, and they stated that this should be a one-to-one replacement of the latest version of the SIG spring. However, when I put calipers on it, I'm getting a slightly larger wire diameter than the stock one. So perhaps a small combination of both the different metal as well as minimal increase in wire diameter is what gives the spring its slightly stronger return weight. By hand, I feel like there is a difference between the two springs as well, but this may just be a psychosomatic perception. The Armory Craft spring has the same number of active coils and the same attachment methods to the fire control unit, so either way, there is obviously a very small difference between the Armory Craft spring and the stock SIG spring in order to facilitate the change in spring force. Now let's look at how to remove your existing return spring and install the Armory Craft spring. As always, make sure that your firearm is completely unloaded and safe. With the slide locked to the rear, go ahead and rotate your takedown lever, and while maintaining control, remove your slide. Once the slide is off, pull your takedown lever out from the grip module. Use the trigger to push up on the FCU from the bottom and pull out towards the front of the grip module. One of the easiest ways to remove an already installed trigger reset spring without bending it is to rotate the spring away from the FCU and press in with your thumb. This will push the J-hook portion of the spring out of the back of the eye hole on the FCU. Now you can remove your trigger bar and trigger by pulling the trigger straight out to the side. You'll need to have the trigger rotated slightly forward. You're now ready to install your Armory Craft return spring. This may also be an opportune time to do a deep cleaning of your SIG, so if you need any cleaning and lubricant products, be sure to check out SPG1Tactical.com for some S2S 5-in-1 Gun Lube. The easiest way to install your new spring and how it was taught at the SIG P320 Armorers course is to first install the dogleg portion into your trigger bar, making sure it fully seats correctly. Next, take the J-hook and hook it into the FCU eye hole from underneath. Your trigger bar will be somewhere between vertical or upside down. Then carefully but simply start to rotate your trigger bar around so that it is in the upright position. The back of the trigger guard will sit behind the sear housing initially, and this is perfectly fine. We'll then take our trigger and begin to insert it into the FCU. The tricky part here is to begin aligning the trigger bar hole with the trigger linkage extrusion. As you rock the trigger bar back and forth, eventually the hole and extrusion will line up and the rear of the trigger bar will fall into the sear housing. If you can pull the trigger back and it resets without any issues, you should have successfully installed the spring. You can now reinsert the FCU into the grip module tail end first. Sometimes it helps to depress the trigger or put it in first. Reinsert your takedown lever, making sure it is in the 5 o'clock-ish position. Before putting your slide back on, you can go ahead and put a couple drops of S2S onto the friction areas of the FCU and slide. Then put your slide back on, locking it to the rear and rotating that takedown lever back into the locked position. Finally, perform a function test to make sure that there are no issues with your trigger activating and resetting correctly. Now that we've installed the Armory Craft spring, let's take a look at the test results. I do wish that I had more 320s and more springs to try this testing with, but what I did have on hand was 3 fire control units, 2 of which have Armory Craft triggers installed, and 1 that's stock with a curved trigger. To develop a baseline, I went ahead and took 10 measurements each of the break weight and reset weight of each of the FCUs as they were. I attempted to keep my location on the triggers and angle of pull as similar and consistent as possible. The break weight was simple, and I would just maintain control of the firearm while on a stand and pull the wheeler trigger gauge back until the striker engaged. For the reset weight, I would manually pull the trigger past the break and then replace my finger with the trigger gauge as carefully as possible. Occasionally, I would get an accidental reading and would go ahead and delete that data set. I would then allow the weight of the trigger return to give me a maximum return force. There may be more scientifically controlled methods to test this, but I went with what I felt was logical and with what I had available to me. What I found were some good but interesting results. In all 3 tests, the reset weight was increased. The stock trigger reset was increased by 11%, while only having 2.3% increase in trigger pull, which is right around advertised. My Armory Craft blue trigger reset was increased, but only by 5.6% or about 2 ounces, compared to an increase of 8 to 11% of trigger pull. Not quite sure what may have caused this, and I made the mistake of tossing the old springs together in a pile, so I wasn't able to easily replicate the testing. I did do a second string of testing on the blue trigger post-swap, and the average break weight did come down, but still above what was expected. This very well may be human error, but the difference we're talking about for the break weight is between 5 and 7 ounces. This is still less than half a pound, which is still within advertised specs for the spring. But what I did notice is that this brought the blue trigger on par with the stock and gold triggers as far as weights. And my Armory Craft gold trigger, the one that started this whole process, had a reset increase of a whopping 37.7%, while only increasing trigger pull by 1.5% or 1 ounce. Now that certainly made me do a double take and come to an important conclusion. My return spring was either bent or worn out. And sure enough, I went back to the 3 springs I replaced and could easily pick out the one that was most likely with my gold trigger. So the Armory Craft Positive Reset Spring most certainly did what it was supposed to do. It increased trigger reset with minimal trigger pull increase. But even more so, it illuminated the importance of inspecting and replacing your springs as needed. The SIG P320 Armorer's book recommends replacing your trigger bar spring every 10,000 rounds. Now, I play Barbie so much with my SIGs that I don't always keep a perfect count of rounds fired, but I can state that I've had some of my 320s for years and have never replaced one of these springs. So this was a great eye-opening experience in terms of standard wear of springs and then maintenance of replacing them. So if you find yourself with a SIG P320 that just doesn't feel like it's returning as positively as it should, this simple and cheap investment seems like a great way to rectify that problem. But there you have it, a simple down and dirty review of the Armory Craft Positive Reset Trigger Return Spring. If you found this video helpful, please go ahead and use those trigger fingers to tap or click on those like and subscribe buttons to help out the channel. This will allow us to build up to bigger and better reviews and keep you updated on future videos that come out. For great training, check out Intuitive Self-Protection at intuitivesp.com or the ISP Facebook page for course schedules, videos, and testimonials. If you're looking to step up your skill level on pistol, carbine, empty hand, or edge weapons defense, I guarantee you will not leave the same person. Head over to SPG1Tactical.com where you can find S2S 5-in-1 Gun Lube, a copy of the book that I helped to co-author, The 6 Bullets You Can't Leave Home Without, a book club with recommended books and forums to discuss, endorsed gear, and more. And lastly, be sure to stay safe, stay smart, and stay tactical, my friends.